Hello everyone and welcome to Vintage Pens for the Modern User. I'm glad you're joining me today. There has been a panel discussion at several pen shows the last couple of years in the United States that has attempted to address the issues for modern users who are curious about vintage pens but simply unsure where to begin. I'm attempting to bring some of that in condensed form here to you on the internet for ease of use and repeated access as necessary. Now, one of the things that the discussion often brings up is why should someone who is using a modern pen even want to explore a vintage pen? And the reason for that can be multifaceted and certainly subjective. However, I think most people will find and agree that when it comes to using a fountain pen, and even potentially delving into collecting a fountain pen, that vintage pens offer such an array of diversity and individual expression that modern pens offer, but modern pens are a little bit more restricted and easier for multiple people to find the same pen. So if you're looking for individual expression, that may be one reason that you may want to start exploring vintage pens that would set you a little bit apart as a user and draw others into the hobby, which is always nice for fountain pens. Another reason I've often found vintage pens to be appealing, even as user instruments, is their quality of materials. Vintage fountain pens have been made for over 100 years, and they were tools to be used every day. They were the writing instrument that people used, either that or graphite pencil. And as a result, they had to withstand a certain level of durability that, for most standards, modern pens are not necessarily built to withstand. I'm not knocking modern pens as quality instruments. I'm just stating that in today's writing world, we have many other elements of communication. Often many of us today don't even use a writing instrument. We are at a computer or using our phones or other means of electronic communication, and we forget of even putting pen or pencil to paper. So when these writing instruments were made, it was the means of communication. It was the most efficient means of communication. And as a result, they were built to a standard that needed to endure that constant daily use. So they're high quality writing instruments, even the most accessible ones. Another reason you may want to consider vintage pens, or something that you haven't potentially considered, is there's a great deal of variety. Many people are looking to express themselves with unique nib options. Those existed and have existed for the entirety of fountain pens. In fact, vintage pens, by and large, offer a wider variety of expressive writing options that today's modern fountain pens have really honed in on a few of those. So there's a little bit more of a limited expressivity when you use a modern fountain pen versus when you begin to delve into all of the options for the nib, the writing point, the tip, and the way that it can be used to express yourself in written form. So today I'm going to look at a broad overview of a few vintage pens. Often in these panels we are asked to give examples of some of the best vintage pens that a person may want to begin with as they explore. So I'm going to talk you through them today. I have 5 options here in front of me that I will show you and discuss. And then in some future videos, I will explore each of those 5 options into more details. There's often a divide in the community. I'm a user, not a collector. And again, very subjective term and very limiting term. I would think that many people who use pens perhaps like to have more than one. And many people who collect pens also use the pens that they collect. Now, there's a lot more to flesh out in those statements, but on the surface level, users can be collectors and collectors can be users. So with that openness of mind, I have 5 pens here that you will hear about. The Esterbrook J pen. This is not the modern Esterbrook, but if you have explored modern Estabrooks, perhaps the name familiarity will draw you to it. These were very durable pens, very well made and very inexpensive, and so they're very approachable for the modern user who's looking to explore vintage pens. They also come with a variety of interchangeable nibs that you can find to give one pen many options and therefore give you that expressivity that you might want. Another pen that I often suggest for vintage users is the Parker 45. The Parker 45 was a cartridge and converter filled mechanism fountain pen. And so for those that are a little bit squeamish about some of the early filling mechanisms, the Parker 45 has some usability features that you may find approachable as you begin to delve into vintage. We're not going to discuss what makes a pen vintage. That is certainly a subjective term, and the delineation for that continues to change as history progresses forward. So I will say that the Parker 45 qualifies itself as a vintage fountain pen, even with this modern type of cartridge converter mechanism. The cartridges and converters that Parker made are proprietary, but the advantage is they have not changed the design. And so you can go today and buy Parker converters or Parker cartridges, and they will fit these vintage Parker 45 pens, making them a very good fit for someone who's interested in exploring. The Parker 45 also does come with interchangeable nib options. Another pen in front of me is another Parker, the Parker 51. Parker 51 was made in 1941. You may decide to avoid the early Parker 51s as they used a vacuumatic filling mechanism. It is my preferred mechanism for the pen. However, in 1948, they changed to the aerometric filler, which is like a squeeze converter that is permanently attached to the pen. It can be serviced, however, that should be done by an experienced repair person. These pens are often very durable, and simple cleaning and flushing is required, and buying one that's already been overhauled will benefit you well. They come in a nice options of colors and a variety of caps. They are slip caps, as is the Parker 45. We'll talk about that later, but another thing that you may be interested in as a modern user who's used to just pulling the cap straight off rather than twisting a cap. Two other pens sort of fit into a similar category. They're Watermans. Watermans 52 is a good starter pen. They're plentiful and they do have some nice nib options, especially for those who are looking to explore flexible nibs. Modern pens with flexible nibs are nothing compared to vintage pens with flexible nibs. And so if you are someone who is interested in exploring that, I would say to do so and finding yourself a vintage Waterman 52 would be a good place to start. Another vintage Waterman is a Waterman's 12. I do not have that on the desk. I have something from the same category, which is a dropper filled pen. That is a very basic mechanism, the earliest way that pens were taken from being in pen holders to having self-contained ink within the pen. And so I have in front of me a Rexall, early Rexall hard rubber fountain pen, but it is to demonstrate that the dropper filling pens can also be a good place for people who are wanting to explore vintage, especially since some people do dropper fill their modern pens. So let's look a little closer at the pens now. So here we have the Estabrooks fountain pen. These were made in two commonly found groups. One was called the dollar pen, which was the first group, and then later on they came out with what was called the J series. This is from the J series, slightly later, but every bit as good, and the nibs are interchangeable between the dollar pens and the J series. This pen, you'll notice, has a lever here, and so that makes it a lever filler. Inside the pen is a sack that is compressed when you pull the lever. I'm not certain whether or not this one has been restored. I believe it has, yes. So you see the lever comes up like this. You would immerse the nib in ink and then snap the lever back and give it a little bit of time to fill with ink. And it fills rather quickly. There's no need to work the lever more than one time. The nibs on these were interchangeable, giving users a wide variety of writing points. they were threaded in. And so by simply unthreading the nib, the user could take a nib and swap it out with another one. This was actually a point of sale idea, but these nibs were made, the lower tier nibs, the 1000 and 2000 series, the quality of the nib wore out and was known that that would happen, and so it was intended that it would be replaced anyways. Nibs were not expensive to buy these units and put in. Today, I would encourage users to find the 9000 series nibs because they have better tipping, they're more durable, and last longer. You can go online, do a little research about the Estabrook J pen and the nibs, the Renew Point nibs that come in the pens, and learn about the different options for writing. Extra fine, fine, medium, broad. They had italics. They did even have steel flexible nibs, which are a little more challenging to find. This pen would be quite affordable for the modern user looking to dabble. I would of course recommend finding pens that have been restored. We can talk later in another film about vintage pen restoration, but buying one that's been restored will serve you well. There were a variety of colors that you could find. This is gray, there was black, green, copper, red, blue, and again, they also had short ones that were in pastel colors. They had full-size pens, they had thin pens. The dollar pens have different clips here and different tops on them here, also in a variety of sizes, short and long, and again with the same options for nibs. So you may often hear people say the Estabrook dollar pen or the Estabrook J is a good starting point, and I would agree. This is the Parker 45 that I mentioned. It's quite a nice streamlined pen, a little bit thinner, which can be good for those who like slender pens. It fits quite nicely in the hand when capped and can be used relatively well. Just a side note, I am left-handed, and for those who say I can't use a fountain pen because I'm left-handed, I say to you, pshaw. It's very possible. This has a modern Parker converter. As I mentioned, the Parker cartridges and converters that were made when these pens were new are still in production today. They did not change that design over the course of Parker pens. And so you can, of course, use this with bottled ink with this converter that's here, or you can buy a Parker cartridge. You can see how it disassembles and how convenient that might be for someone who is familiar with modern pens and the cartridge converter system that modern pens have. This nib unit also unscrews. However, I do advise caution for people on doing so. Whether or not the pen has been restored and how much ink is in here may make it difficult. So I'm not going to do that in this video. I am going to have some videos that are going to delve even deeper into each of these fountain pens in a separate series in which I can disassemble the pens and show you some of the nuances. But these nibs, again, come in a variety. They come in steel and in gold, and they come in a variety of points from extra fine all the way up to broad and even stub points. You will not find flexible tips with these, so don't even try. Pushing a nib like this that's not designed to be flexible will damage the nib and potentially even the unit that holds the nib into it. But you can express yourself nicely with an italic nib or a stub nib or a broad nib, or if you like to write on a post-it note, you can find extra fine and fine to be to your suitable. So very good quality. Again, there's a lot of colors in this pen. They even made some that were metal. You can find one that is gold filled. You could find one that is all stainless. You can find a good variety of colors to suit your preference. Again, we'll explore all these pens in more detail in some other videos. Similar to the Parker 45, but preceding it in production is the Parker 51. I mentioned the two filling mechanisms the 51 had, and I often advise people who are new from modern going to vintage to look for the aerometric filling mechanism. Those pens were made after 1948, and so you will find that they will unscrew here where the section and barrel meet, as you would expect, and you can find this has been restored, has a nice clear sack inside, the sack protector here, so it works much like you would think of a converter working. A squeeze converter, if you've ever encountered a squeeze converter, you press down here on the side, and with this one you would do it multiple times because there is a filler tube in here that allows, by cycling, compressing about 4 to 6 times, you cycle in and get the most ink that you can. These held a tremendous volume of ink, and they were known to never write dry because of the hood here and the ink collector which is inside. You can see the nib, very difficult to see. If you're one that likes to show off your nib, this may not be the pen for you, but these are some of the smoothest, well-writing vintage pens that can be found. And this is not a pen to be serviced by the user. This would be a pen, if needing service, that you should send in. But as I mentioned before, if you find one that has already been serviced, it will last you a good long time, so long as you care for your pen well. Finding different writing points on these is possible. It's a little bit less common to find broad tips, but certainly extra fine, fine, and medium tips are readily available. The more unique broad or even stub tips, less common. And again, don't look for a flexible nib in this pen. This system was just not designed for that, where you can see how the hood comes to the end. Pushing down hard on this pen was not the point. And as a note about flexible pens, pushing down hard is never the point on any fountain pen. The pen should write under its own weight. When you get a flexible nib, it is an art form to learn to use it. And again, it is not about pushing down hard. It is subtle changes in pressure. Speaking of flexible nibs, here we have, this is a Parker 55, but Parker 52 is going to be Parker and Waterman did a lot of litigation, and they would be dissatisfied with my misspeech there. This is a Waterman's 55, Waterman fountain pen. I mentioned the Waterman 52 earlier. They came in a variety of sizes. 52 is probably the most common and easily found, 52, 52 and a half, 52V. But again, it's a lever filling hard rubber fountain pen, quite durable. Many people will talk about vintage pens as being fragile, but again, as I mentioned, these were designed to be used every day for years and years and years and years. So the fragility of these pens is sometimes overstated, because you do sometimes run across pens that are more delicate, perhaps they're rarer, and so you'll find at a pen show perhaps collectors being a little finicky depending on the pen you pick up. If you were to pick up a 55 that was a bright orange color, for example, that would be a pen to be cautious with, as that red hard rubber is quite fragile. This is black hard rubber, and it's very stable. Not to say that you shouldn't exercise caution as you would with any fountain pen, but it's quite usable. This nib here is a Waterman's nib, gorgeous nibs, very high quality nibs, and entirely possible that it has a bit of flexibility to it. I'm not going to push hard. You don't need to push hard, but if you were writing with this pen and your downstrokes, you pulled a little bit more towards yourself, you would find some good line variation. That's a common thing that you will find with Watermans, early Watermans in particular, which is why people seek them out. This is also a lever filling mechanism. It's a different lever filler than the Esterbrook because it's not spring loaded. There's a bar inside, and so you do have to actually return this. It's not going to snap down on its own. If you find one of these unrestored, do not pull the lever, because this mechanism is easily broken by ossified sack remnants and other things inside. Again, I would always advise modern users looking to go vintage to start by buying something that's been restored and sold by a dealer who offers a good warranty and knows what they're doing. Very easy to do that. But you would, again, pull the lever here. It's a very basic mechanism. It's not something to be afraid of. Snap it back, let the ink draw in, and then you're good to go. This, because of the size of the pen, actually holds a nice quantity of ink. Okay, so this is the black hard rubber Waterman 55. We can explore Waterman 52. That's what this was sort of representing.
we'll explore some of the Waterman series again in another video. And finally, I mentioned the Waterman's 12, and I didn't grab one. There were many dropper filling pens. You'll hear people talk about eyedropper, and there's some debate about the terminology because I would not advise you using your eyedropper with ink in it because you don't want to cross-contaminate. So use just a regular dropper to fill this with ink. It unscrews at the section, and that's really all there is to it. If you find a curved-tipped dropper, you'll find less likelihood for bubbles, and you just feed the end there with the ink. You can, of course, put a little small dollop, minute of silicone grease, pure silicone grease on those threads. I'm a little bit unconvinced. It wasn't what was done originally, introducing materials to pens that weren't originally intended. I have some reservations about. However, if you're going to use a pen like this regularly and you want some reassurance, again, this is a common enough, easy enough to find. This is a Rexall drugstores, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And so you can, of course, find lesser quality, but still good quality pens that were made from the time period. Also possibly likely to have some flexible nibs in these early pens. Now this is a slip cap. There's a friction fit. So this is probably not a pen you're going to put in your purse or in your pocket and walk around with. But if you're sitting at your desk and you want to write some nice notes, it's a good one to have on the desk. And it would post, of course, and give you a nice, comfortable option to write. Ease of use, ease of cleaning. So the earliest, most vintage pens are quite approachable for the modern user. That's all for today. I appreciate you joining me as we explored these 5 vintage fountain pens as options that a modern user may want to consider. And in some future videos, we'll go into a little more depth about each of these, show you some more of the options that I mentioned today that they have, and we'll even start to explore how the pens are constructed, destructed, as well as using them.